name is Carolyn Patterson, and I am here to talk about the anthology I put together in 2006 called Montana Women Writers, A Geography of the Heart. I put this anthology together because basically I wanted to read it. I wanted to gather together all of the women writers that I had read, and then I wanted to discover a lot of the women writers I hadn't read over the past 300 years. What I found when I put the writers together and then I wanted to organize them, what I didn't want to do is organize them chronologically. I was really interested in organizing them by geography. Part of the reason for this is that Montanans relate so profoundly to the place that they live, and so much of the writing in this is so affected by place, and the writers are writing quite a bit about the places that they are, where they live. So I organized the book in three sections. One is about the plain. One section is about the plains. Another section is about the mountains, and the other section is about towns. And what interested me was to put writers back to back who lived in the same areas, but maybe were 100 years apart in those very areas. The other thing I noticed was that there are three kind of distinct periods. There were the early frontier women coming who, were coming from other places. They had a really distinct and profound experience homesteading in Montana. There were women in the 1920s who, many women who were starting to write for newspapers. There were a lot of women who were educated at the University of Montana under H.G. Merriam, who worked for the Frontier, a great literary magazine here, and were often hired by him as assistant editors. And then there was a real flowering of literary talent in the really the 60s through today, that was also kind of centered around the University of Montana and their creative writing department, and then teachers and so on who kind of flowed out from that. So I'm just going to read you three distinct women from very distinct periods in Montana history, and starting with Nannie Alderson, who came, settled in Montana in 1882. She came from Virginia. She came from a plantation. Her family owned slaves. She had a very pampered upbringing, and then suddenly found herself on a frontier in Bernie, Montana with her husband in a very, very different lifestyle. And this is from her book called A Bride Goes West. Sometimes I wonder if too much hasn't been said about the grim aspects of frontier life. Later on in my marriage, I came down to hard, bare facts, to loneliness and poverty. But that first spring and summer, I was anything but lonely in spite of the lack of women. I had much to learn and hard work to do, but I had no children to look after. I lived in surroundings of great beauty. I was happy in my marriage, and pioneering still seemed rather romantic. We had plenty of visitors. Although ranches were far apart, our near neighbors being 5 to 10 miles distant, the men were always riding around looking for lost horses or moving stock, and as summertime approached, reps from miles away, even hundreds of miles, would come riding by on their way to join the roundup, and they would stop with us. A rep was a cowboy sent out by his outfit to represent them on some other part of the range and gather up stray cattle bearing their brand. There were no fences, the cattle drifted for many miles, and these riders came to us from long distances, from Belle Fourche in South Dakota, from Sundance on the edge of the Black Hills. Each would be traveling with a string of horses, his bed packed across the back of one. He would ride in, turn his horses in with ours, and stay for a meal or a night. If for the night, he would just throw his bed down out of doors. Later, I heard that quite a joke was made on the roundup about the number of reps who found it necessary to pass by the Zook and Alderson ranch. So the next piece I'm going to read is by Debra Earling. She's a contemporary writer Native American writer. She's a Salish writer, and she wrote a beautiful book, Perma-Red, which won a number of awards and is going to be made into a series, a television series. She's a professor of fiction and Native American studies at the University of Montana. And this is just a short excerpt from an essay. She writes very beautifully about the growing up in about land and the reservation. And this is just a short excerpt from that. It's called Bad Ways. On the Flathead Reservation, you can come to a spot on the road where the wind smells like sulfur, a dark smell, something you think you should be able to leave behind you, but it will be in your clothing and in your shoes. And there will be a darkness in the way you see things, a darkness you wish you could leave. The Indians say it is because of the old white man ghost that haunts the Dixon side of the river, the old white man ghost that rode through the land before Dixon was a town, because there were some Indians a long time ago, and these Indians had listened to too many white men, and they had found themselves hungry with only empty pockets of land that had a stinging edge, a bitter taste like silk dark water on a beaver pond, a land they couldn't leave or see beyond, or even move for a short time, a land where the dark fish began leaving the rivers as if they were being washed away by an angry, pulling current. So finally, the last piece I wanted to read an excerpt of is by Mary Maclane. And she's someone who wrote about Butte in 1901 and kind of set Butte on its ear. Butte at the time was a thriving mining town, and she was just a wild woman. She was feminist, she was bisexual. She wrote this book called The Story of Mary Maclane. It was basically a memoir. And the book sold 100,000 copies when it came out, which was a huge number of copies for a book at the time. But she writes wonderfully about Butte at the time, and I'll just read a short excerpt from that. The town of Butte presents a wonderful field to a student of humanity and human nature. There are not a great many people, 70,000 perhaps, but those 70,000 are in their way unparalleled. For mixture, for miscellany, variedness, bohemianism, where is Butte's rival? The population is not only of all nationalities and stations, but the nationalities and stations mix and mingle promiscuously with each other and are partially concealed and partly revealed in the mazes of a veneer that belongs neither to nation nor to station, but to Butte. The nationalities are many, it is true, but Irish and Cornish predominate. My acquaintance extends widely among the inhabitants of Butte. Sometimes, when I feel in the mood for it, I spend an afternoon in visiting about among diverse, curious people. At some 4th of July demonstration or on a miners' day, the heterogeneous herd turns out, and I turn out with the herd and of it and meditate and look on. There are Irishmen, Kellys, Caseys, Callahans, staggering under the weight of much whiskey, shouting out their Green Isle maxims. There is the festive Cornishman, ogling and leering, greeting his fellow countrymen with alcoholic heartiness and gazing after every feminine creature with lustful eyes. There are Irish women swearing genially at each other in shrill pleasantry, and 5 or 6 loudly vociferous children for each. There are round-faced Cornish women, likewise, each with their train of children. There are suave, sleek sporting men just out of the bathtub, insignificant lawyers, dentists, messenger boys, plungers without number, greasy Italians from Meaderville, greasier French people from the Boulevard Addition, ancient miners, each of whom was the first to stake a claim in Butte, starved-looking Chinamen here and there, a contingent of Finns and Swedes and Germans, musty, stuffy old Jew pawnbrokers who have crawled out of their holes for a brief recreation, dirt-encrusted Indians in their dirty gay blankets from their flea-haunted camp beyond town, box wrestlers who are as common in Butte as barmaids in Ireland, swell, flashy-looking Africans, respectable women in white aprons tied around their waists and sailor hats on their heads, who have left children at home and stepped out to see what was going on. Innumerable stray youngsters from the dark haunts of Dublin Gulch, heavy restaurant keepers with toothpicks in their mouths, a vaster army of dry goods clerks, the paper-collared gentry, miners of every description, representatives from Dogtown, Chicken Flats, Busterville, Butchertown, and Seldom Seen, suburbs of Butte, pale, thin individuals who sing and dance in beer halls, smart society people, people in high traps and tally-hos, impossible women, so-called, though in Butte no one is more possible, in vast hats and extremely plaid stockings, persons who take things seriously and play the races for a living, beer jerkers, biscuit shooters, soft-voiced Mexicans and Arabians, the dregs, the elite, the humbly respectable, the off-scouring, all thrown together and shaken up and mixed well.
That was like an amazing, the prose sounded crowded. Oh, when you were putting together this anthology, or even just the 3 pieces that you just read, were there themes about Montana landscape or women's experiences in Montana that stood out to you?
One was loneliness. Women craving other women's company. Came through a lot. But also, I think that it was, and sometimes I think it was very, what's the word I want? Sometimes I thought it was very destructive, and sometimes I thought it was very productive, So, I thought there were, and it depended, a lot of times it depended on when it was happening. So early on, a lot of these early frontier women, came from other places, and they were shocked by how lonely they were, because they were so isolated. So a lot of those early women set about like organizing schools and women's groups and churches and organizations, and they were sort of the backbone of a lot of those things in Montana. But then there was a period where, I think where a lot of women kind of got stranded on these ranches. And then you saw this period where there were some very sad, and also the economics turned basically from the 1910s through really the end of the Depression, where a lot of people were poor, they were struggling, they were either getting ready to, the farms were working out, and they were really stranded on these ranches. And then there's just a profound sense of isolation that seems kind of inescapable.
And did that isolation and loneliness continue into the contemporary women writers' experiences?
Somewhat, but it's different. I feel like the relationship to the outdoors changes with female. I mean, it's almost like it's something they seek, in contemporary women writers, which is interesting. It's a different relationship to the outdoors, because when you come out here and you're surrounded by it, it's not like, I mean, they appreciate the beauty and everything, but it's not like you're going to go seeking nature because you're surrounded by it, all the time. And also there's more of a fear of it, because their lives are pretty fragile. And, when you're in towns and, you're more isolated from it, there's not that same sense of fragility in the wilderness, I think, that we have. It was very interesting to, I think of women's lives, need for for companionship, need for society, and community is so profound. But also, that's not to say that, they were always, seeking the next bridge group or something. A lot of women found a lot of joy in the outdoors and being alone and so on.
I know a lot of times when you give this talk, you also do a writing workshop. What resources are there? And now with COVID and the isolation that we're experiencing, do you know of any resources for writers to still like gather or break through that isolation or be creative today? Women writers or men?
I think online writing classes, we're doing that through the collaborative, but also there are a lot of free writing classes out there. I know the University of Iowa has some. I think the International School of Writing at Iowa has some, and they're free. That's a great way to do it. I think even just setting up writing prompts with your friends or family is a great way to do it. One of the things, the other thing I've done with these classes is had people tell stories about women and their families, and some of the stories were incredible. One fellow told a story about this woman in Livingston who she was a railroader, and she was kind of looked down on among the other more proper women in the town. But when it came time they were building a new church, and she knew how to operate heavy machinery, and she dug the whole basement of the church out, and she got some respect. It was just a great story. But there were stories about women homesteaders. They were just amazing stories about single women ranchers, and they're stories that need to be written.
Yeah. Well, I hope that people listen to this and share their stories and
I do too.
Connect. Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we close up here?
I just encourage people to write down those stories, even if it's just a page.
Awesome. Thank you. And send them to us. We'd love to share them.
Yeah.
Humanities Montana and with you. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here with me.
Thank you, Sam.